The sun was already warm on the cobblestones of the town square, promising a perfect Saturday. It was the kind of morning that made people feel good to be alive. The annual farmers' market was in full swing, a cheerful explosion of color and sound. Brightly colored tents lined the square, their awnings shielding tables piled high with vibrant red tomatoes, deep green lettuce, and golden ears of corn. The air, thick with the delicious smell of fresh-baked bread roasting at a nearby stall and the rich aroma of brewing coffee, was a happy mix of weekend relaxation and community spirit. Families wandered lazily from stall to stall. Children pointed at jars of golden honey, their faces sticky from a shared pastry. A gentle, friendly chatter was the constant background noise, punctuated by laughter and the occasional greeting between neighbors. On a small wooden stage at one end of the square, a young man with a guitar was singing folksy songs, his voice a pleasant, soothing hum that blended perfectly with the peaceful morning. Everything was orderly, calm, and exactly as the organizers had planned. Then, he arrived. He was an old man, perhaps in his late 70s, with a frame that was thin but seemed to carry the weight of many years. He wore a simple, slightly worn tweed jacket, even in the warmth, and scuffed leather shoes that had walked many miles. In one hand, he carried a worn wooden stool, and in the other, a violin case that looked as old as he was, covered in scuffs and scratches that told a story of a life on the move. He didn't look at the colorful stalls or the happy faces. His eyes were fixed on a small, empty patch of ground near the central fountain, spot just slightly away from the main flow of foot traffic. He moved with a quiet purpose, setting his stool down with a soft click. He didn't ask for permission or seem to care that he was an outsider to this curated event. He simply opened the battered case. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, was a violin whose wood gleamed with a deep, honeyed luster, a stark contrast to its worn case. He handled it with a gentle reverence, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. He tightened the strings, rosined his bow with slow, deliberate movements, all while the world bustled around him, completely unaware of the storm that was about to break. Without a word, without a nod to the small group of people who had begun to notice him, he tucked the violin under his chin. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and then he began to play. The sound that erupted was not music. It was a force. It was a raw, powerful, and deafening wave of classical sound that didn't just join the market's noise, it sliced right through it. The gentle guitar from the stage vanished completely. The happy chatter of the crowd died down as heads turned in the direction of the sound. The music was frantic, almost angry, filled with a frantic, desperate energy that felt completely out of place. It was beautiful, in a way, but it was also overwhelming. The notes were sharp and insistent, pouring from the violin like a flood, vibrating in the very chests of the people standing nearby. A small crowd began to form, a silent, curious circle around the old man. They were drawn by the sheer intensity of the performance. A young woman with a camera stopped, her hand hovering over the shutter, mesmerized by the look on the old man's face. His eyes were squeezed shut, his brow furrowed in deep concentration, his white hair catching the sunlight. He wasn't just playing the violin. He was battling it, wrestling a torrent of emotion from its strings. His whole body swayed with the music, a frantic, almost painful dance. But not everyone was captivated. A mother holding a toddler winced as the high notes pierced the air, gently covering her little girl's ears. A couple trying to enjoy a coffee at a nearby table shot annoyed glances at the old man, their conversation impossible. People near the stage looked back and forth between the frustrated folk singer, who had stopped playing, and the source of the sonic invasion. The peaceful, happy atmosphere of the market was being shattered, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable dissonance. From a booth decorated with banners and schedules, the young couple who had organized the event watched with growing concern. The woman, whose name tag read Event Director, tapped her pen nervously against her clipboard. This was not part of the plan. Their market was a family-friendly, carefully managed experience. This was chaos. It was a beautiful, skilled chaos, but it was disrupting everything. The scheduled performer on stage was now just standing there, awkwardly holding his guitar. The vendors were starting to look worried. The vibe was all wrong. The man beside her, her partner in running the event, folded his arms. His jaw was tight. He was the practical one, the one who focused on the schedule and the permits. He leaned over and said something to her, his voice too low to be heard over the violin's roar. She nodded, her expression a mixture of frustration and a reluctant, grudging respect for the old man's sheer talent and nerve. She had a job to do. She had to protect the event they had worked so hard to create. Taking a deep breath, she pasted a polite, professional smile on her face, a mask to hide her irritation, and began to make her way through the frozen crowd toward the source of the beautiful, terrible noise. The event director moved through the crowd like a ship parting a sea. The closer she got to the center of the sonic storm, the more the music changed. It wasn't just loud anymore. It was a physical presence. The notes seemed to beat against her eardrums like a tiny, frantic hammer, and she could feel a deep vibration in her chest cavity, thrumming, that echoed the frantic pace of her own heart. The faces of the people she passed were a confusing mix of emotions. Some wore a look of pure awe, their mouths slightly open. Their eyes locked on the old man as if he were a prophet delivering a fiery sermon. Others, however, looked pained and annoyed. A man holding a large pumpkin frowned, shaking his head as the high, piercing notes cut through the air. Two women who had been chatting now stood in uncomfortable silence, their hands over their ears. A knot of frustration tightened in her stomach. This was her market, her carefully constructed weekend of peace and community. This man, with his incredible, disruptive talent, was tearing a hole in it all. She had a schedule to maintain, vendors who paid good money for a pleasant atmosphere, and a performer on stage who was now completely silenced. She had a responsibility to all of them. Yet, as she pushed past a final row of onlookers, a wave of something else washed over her, reluctant, grudging respect. Up close, she could see the sheer physical effort it took. A thin sheen of sweat glistened on the old man's brow, and the muscles in his neck stood out like taut cords. His fingers, though wrinkled and spotted with age, flew across the strings of the violin with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. He was pouring every ounce of his being into the music. She reached the edge of the small, clear circle around the performer. The ground here seemed to vibrate more intensely. The air felt electric, charged with the raw emotion pouring from the instrument. The old man's eyes were still squeezed shut, his face a mask of such intense concentration and sorrow that it was almost painful to look at. He wasn't aware of her. He wasn't aware of the crowd, the market, or the world beyond the four strings of his violin. He was completely lost, transported to another place in time by the torrent of sound he was creating. The event director stood there for a moment, feeling like an intruder at a very private, very loud prayer. She had planned to wait for a natural pause in the music, a moment between phrases where she could politely get his attention. But as the minutes ticked by, she realized there might not be a pause. The piece was a relentless, rushing river of sound. With no calm eddies in which to step, the crowd around her was now completely silent, their earlier murmurs of curiosity and complaint drowned out by the violin. They were all captivated, held hostage by the performance. She felt their eyes on her, the unofficial enforcer of order, waiting to see what she would do. The pressure mounted. She couldn't just stand there forever. Taking a deep breath, she decided she had to break the spell. She took a half step forward, her hand reaching out. The moment her fingers made contact with the rough fabric of his tweed jacket, she felt a jolt, as if she had touched a live wire. He didn't react. He didn't flinch or open his eyes. The music continued just as frantic and loud as before, a torrent of sound that completely ignored her physical presence. She felt a flush of embarrassment and a spike of irritation. She was invisible. Her authority, her carefully planned event, her very presence meant nothing to this man and his music. She pulled her hand back, then steeled herself. This had to work. Leaning in close, she raised her voice, trying to project it over the wall of sound. "Excuse me, sir," she shouted, her voice sounding thin and reedy against the powerful violin. "Sir?" He didn't hear her, or if he did, He gave no sign. His body swayed, his bow dancing across the strings, lost in a world of his own making. The scent of old wood and rosin filled her nostrils. She could see the individual hairs on the bow, frayed and worn, straining with each powerful stroke. Frustration won out over politeness. She leaned in even closer, her mouth almost near his ear, and raised her voice to its full volume. "Sir, you're very talented, but you're overpowering the main stage," she yelled, her voice tight with the effort. "We're going to have to ask you to lower the volume, or we'll need you to stop." The word "stop" hung in the air, a sharp final command that seemed to cut through the music like a knife. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The frantic melody continued, and she felt a surge of defeat. He was going to ignore her. She was going to have to get security, and the whole situation would become an ugly scene. But then something shifted. The old man's hand, which had been moving with such fluid, desperate speed, began to slow. The frantic energy seemed to drain out of him all at once, and his bow skidded to a halt, letting out a final screeching protest against the strings. And then there was silence. A sudden, jarring, absolute silence that fell over his corner of the market. So complete and so shocking that it was louder than the noise that had come before it. The silence that followed the final screeching note of the violin was not empty. It was a heavy, physical presence, a thick blanket that smothered every other sound in the square. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The gentle strumming of the guitar on the main stage, the distant hum of traffic, the cheerful chatter of the marketchet all vanished, swallowed by the sudden, shocking void. The only thing that remained was the faint, pitched, ringing in everyone's ears, a ghost of the noise that had just been. The crowd, which had been a living, breathing entity of shifting bodies and murmuring voices, was now a collection of statues. Every head was turned toward the old man and the young woman who stood beside him. The unwitting cause of the quiet, the event director felt a wave of heat wash over her face, a blush of shame and confusion. She had been so focused on the schedule, the volume, the disruption, that she hadn't considered the person. Now, standing in the profound silence she had created, she felt like a bully who had just kicked a puppy. The old man's hand, which had been moving with such violent grace, was now still, resting on the body of the violin. His whole posture seemed to change. The frantic energy that had held him taut as a wire drained away, and his shoulders slumped, making him appear smaller, frailer. He looked exhausted, as if the music had been a battle he had been fighting, and he had finally lost. Slowly he opened his eyes. They were not the eyes of an angry man who had been interrupted. They were not the eyes of a defiant performer. They were the eyes of someone who had just been woken from a very deep, very far-away dream. They were a pale, watery blue, and they were filled with a deep, glistening sadness that seemed to absorb all the light around them. He didn't look at the event director at first. His gaze drifted over the frozen faces of the crowd, as if seeing them for the first time. He looked at the man with the pumpkin, whose annoyed frown had melted into a look of concern. He looked at the two women who had been covering their ears, their hands now frozen at their sides, their expressions soft with dawning understanding. He looked at the young photographer whose camera was now forgotten, hanging limply around her neck. Then his eyes settled on the event director. She felt a fresh pang of guilt under his gaze. There was no accusation in his look, only a deep, weary confusion. He opened his mouth, then closed it, as if the words were difficult to find. His throat worked, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a startling contrast to the deafening music. It was raspy, quiet, and fragile, yet it carried in the absolute stillness, reaching every person in the silent circle. "Today is our anniversary," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The words were so unexpected, so out of place, that they hung in the air for a moment before their meaning could sink in. The event director just stared, her mind racing to catch up. Anniversary? What was he talking about? The old man's hand, the one that wasn't holding the violin, trembled slightly as he gestured down toward the open violin case at his feet. Following his gaze, the director and the crowd leaned in slightly. Nestled beside the velvet lining was a small, worn photograph. its edges softened and yellowed with age. It was a picture of a woman with a bright, joyful smile and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. Her hair was styled in a way that spoke of a different era, and she was holding a bunch of wildflowers. She looked happy, full of life. The old man looked at the photograph with such tenderness that it was almost painful to witness. 50 years, he continued, his voice cracking slightly on the number. 50 years today? Took a shaky breath, his eyes still fixed on the image of his wife. A single tear escaped and traced a slow path down his wrinkled cheek. He didn't seem to notice. This was her favorite song. She loved it. Said it sounded like the world was feeling everything all at once. All the joy and all the sorrow. He paused, and the crowd remained frozen. Their earlier annoyance completely replaced by a rapt, heartbroken attention. They were no longer just watching a street performer. They were witnessing a sacred moment of grief. He finally lifted his gaze from the photograph and looked at the event director, his eyes pleading for her to understand. I play it for her every year. I come here, to this spot, where we used to meet. He gestured vaguely around the square, and I play it for her. He looked down at his violin, then back at her, and the reason for the volume suddenly became horribly, beautifully clear. I play it loud, he said, his voice dropping to an even more intimate, confessional tone. I play it loud, so she can hear it wherever she is. The raw, unfiltered vulnerability of his confession settled over the crowd like a shroud. It wasn't just a story. It was an offering. He had laid his soul bare for them. The dissonant, frantic music they had heard just moments before was not a performance. It was a prayer. It was a desperate shout into the heavens, a man trying to bridge the impossible gap between this world and the next. The loudness wasn't for them. It was for her. The annoyance on their faces was gone, replaced by a collective, crushing empathy. The crowd didn't just stop moving. They stopped breathing. They were frozen by the sudden tragic weight of the music they had just complained about. They were frozen by the immense love of a man who was still trying to serenade his wife. 50 years after they first met, and God knows how long after she had gone, the event director stood rooted to the spot, her clipboard feeling like a lead weight in her hand. Her professional role shattered into a million pieces by the simple, devastating truth. The silence that fell over the corner of the market was a living thing. It was heavy and thick, pressing down on the shoulders of every person standing in the small circle. The event director felt it most of all. It was a silence of her own making, and it was suffocating. The old man's quiet, heartbreaking words seemed to hang in the air, written in smoke and sorrow. I play it loud, so she can hear it wherever she is. The phrase echoed in her mind, each word a tiny, sharp needle pricking at her conscience. Her clipboard, the symbol of her authority and her carefully planned day, suddenly felt like a slab of cold, heavy stone in her hands. All the schedules, the vendor lists, the timings, it all seemed so utterly pointless, so ridiculously small in the face of this man's immense, enduring love. She stood frozen, her professional mask completely shattered. The polite, firm smile she had worn just moments ago was gone, replaced by an expression of raw, undisguised shame. Her eyes, which had been focused on solving a problem, now welled up with hot tears. She blinked them back, but one escaped, tracing a cool path down her flushed cheek. She saw the scene through a blur of emotion. The old man. His shoulders slumped with a weariness that went far beyond his physical body. The faded photograph of his smiling wife, a testament to a joy that once was. The faces of the crowd, no longer annoyed or curious, but soft, open, and deeply moved. They were no longer a crowd of strangers. They were a congregation gathered around a man who had just shared his most sacred pain. She had tried to silence a prayer, and the weight of that mistake was crushing. The silence stretched on, becoming more profound with each passing second. No one knew what to do or what to say. To speak felt like it would be a sacrilege, a disturbance of this fragile, holy moment. People just stood, their eyes fixed on the old man, their hearts aching for a man they had never met before today. The air was thick with unspoken empathy, a shared, silent understanding that passed from one person to the next. And then, A sound broke the stillness. It came from the edge of the crowd, near a stall selling handmade soaps. It was a single clap. It wasn't loud or boisterous. It was soft, hesitant at first, the sound of one palm meeting the other with a gentle, questioning weight. It was the sound of someone who felt they had to do something, anything, to acknowledge the profound thing they had just witnessed. It wasn't applause for a performance well done. It was an offering of respect, a quiet nod to a man's grief and love. Every head turned slightly toward the sound. An older man in a flour-dusted apron, the baker from a nearby stall, stood with his hands still raised, his eyes on the old violinist. He gave another firmer clap. That was all it took. Like the first drop of rain that signals a coming storm, another person joined in. A young woman with a baby stroller gently brought her hands together. Then a teenager, who had been listening with his headphones around his neck, added his own soft clapping. It wasn't a wave of sound, but a slow, steady ripple. One by one, then in small groups, the people in the crowd began to clap. It was a strange and beautiful kind of applause. It was not cheering or celebratory. It was rhythmic, unified, and deeply sincere. It sounded like a soft, steady heartbeat, a shared pulse of human connection and compassion. It was the sound of a community saying, "Without words, we see you. We hear you. We are with you." The event director's partner, who had been watching from their booth, felt the shift in the atmosphere. He saw the tears on his partner's face and the slow, spreading applause of the crowd. He saw the folk singer on the main stage, standing with a look of reverence, his guitar forgotten. The practical, scheduled-driven part of his brain knew this was throwing a wrench in their perfectly timed event. But the human part of him, the part that had fallen in love with his own partner years ago, understood that something far more important was happening here. This wasn't a disruption anymore. It was the main event. Reaching for the walkie-talkie clipped to his belt, he brought it to his lips. His voice, when he spoke, was uncharacteristically soft, stripped of its usual brisk, authoritative tone. "Hold the main stage," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding by the fountain. "Just give us 5 minutes, maybe 10. He didn't wait for a reply. He clipped the walkie-talkie back onto his belt and began to walk toward the old man. As he approached, the crowd parted for him, a silent acknowledgement of his role. But he didn't walk like an enforcer. He moved with a gentle, deliberate slowness, his expression open and kind. He stopped beside the event director, giving her a brief, reassuring touch on the arm before turning his full attention to the old man. The rhythmic clapping continued all around them, a soft, constant backdrop. The old man looked up at him, his eyes still watery, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and confusion. He seemed to be bracing himself for another request to leave, another dismissal. But the younger man just shook his head slightly, a small, sad smile on his face. He crouched down a little, so he was looking up at the old man, a gesture of humility. He spoke in a low, quiet voice that was full of sincerity. "Sir," he began, his voice steady and clear, "please, don't stop on our account." He glanced around at the faces in the crowd, at the tears and the gentle, rhythmic applause. He looked back at the old man, his gaze direct and earnest. "Play it for her," he said softly. "Play it for all of us." The old man stood there, his violin held loosely at his side, his gaze moving slowly from the kind face of the younger man crouched before him to the event director, whose cheeks were still wet with silent tears. He then looked out, past the inner circle, at the sea of faces that surrounded him. They were no longer the faces of annoyed shoppers or curious onlookers. They were the faces of fellow human beings, their expressions soft, their eyes shining with a shared, unspoken understanding. He saw the baker, his apron dusted with flour, giving him a gentle, encouraging nod. He saw the mother, who had once covered her daughter's ears, now holding the little girl close, both of them watching him with wide, solemn eyes. He saw the teenager, his headphones forgotten, looking at him with a respect that seemed far beyond his years. These people, these strangers, had not just forgiven his disruption, they had embraced his reason for it. A wave of something he hadn't felt in a very long time washed over him, not pity, but a profound, weary gratitude. It was the warmth of being seen, truly seen, in the midst of his deepest, most private grief. He looked back at the younger man, who was still waiting patiently, his offer hanging in the air like a gift. Play it for her. Play it for all of us. The old man's chest rose and fell with a deep, shuddering breath. He gave a slow, single nod. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. A quiet acceptance of their kindness, an agreement to let them into his sacred ritual. He raised the violin once more, tucking it back under his chin with a familiar, practiced ease. But this time, his posture was different. The frantic, desperate tension was gone from his shoulders. He stood straighter, but with a serene, almost weightless grace. He closed his eyes, not in a tight squeeze of concentration, but in a gentle, peaceful closing. He was no longer preparing for a battle. He was preparing for a conversation. And then the music began again. It was the same song. It's the same melody that had torn through the market just minutes before, but it was transformed. The volume was lower for sure, but the change went far deeper than that. The frantic, angry energy had been replaced by a soaring, heartbreaking beauty. The notes were no longer a desperate shout into the void. They were a tender, loving whisper, full of a lifetime of memories. The music flowed now like a deep, steady river instead of a chaotic flood. It was rich and complex, filled with a sweetness that had been hidden before. It was the sound of joy, of laughter, of quiet moments shared. It was the sound of a first dance, of a promise made, of a hand held through sickness and health. The crowd remained perfectly still, a silent, rapt audience to this most intimate of performances. The market, with its colors and smells and sounds, had ceased to exist. There was only this man, his violin, and the powerful, invisible presence of the love he was celebrating. The event director stood with her partner, her hand finding his and squeezing it tightly. The clipboard was gone now, forgotten on the ground somewhere behind her. All the rules, all the schedules, all the worries about permits and vendor complaints had dissolved into nothing. All that mattered was the music and the man who was playing it. She watched as a young couple who had been bickering quietly just moments before now stood with their arms around each other, their heads resting together, lost in the melody. She saw an elderly woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, pull a handkerchief from her purse and dab gently at her eyes, a small knowing smile on her lips. The music was speaking to each of them in a different way, touching their own memories of love and loss, weaving them all together into a single, shared experience. The melody rose and fell, taking the listeners on a journey through 50 years of a life. There were passages that were bright and full of sunshine, echoing the laughter of a young woman in a photograph. There were passages that were somber and reflective, speaking of quiet nights and challenges faced together. And there were passages that were filled with a deep, abiding sorrow, not of anger, but of the profound emptiness that is left behind when a part of your soul is gone. Yet, even in the saddest parts, there was an undercurrent of love, a powerful, breakable thread that held the entire piece together. It was a testament to the fact that love does not end, it simply changes form. As the song moved toward its conclusion, the music began to soften even more. The notes became sparser, like memories fading with time. Each one was clear and perfect, a final, precious thought. The old man's bow moved with a slow, deliberate grace, savoring every last moment. The final note was not a grand, crashing crescendo. It was a single, high, pure tone that hung in the air for a breathtaking moment, shimmering like a star in the quiet twilight of the square. Then, it too began to fade, growing softer and softer until it was just a whisper, an echo, and then finally it was gone. Absorbed into the silence, the old man lowered his instrument, his arm falling to his side. He opened his eyes and looked out at the crowd for a long moment. He did not look for praise or applause. He simply gave a small, humble bow, a gesture of thanks to them for listening, and a final, loving farewell to her. And in that moment, silence was finally broken. It didn't start as a slow clap this time. It started as a single loud gasp from someone in the crowd, a release of the breath they had all been holding. Then another person and another, until the sound swelled into an explosion of thunderous, heartfelt applause. It was not the polite rhythmic clapping from before. It was a loud, joyous, overwhelming wave of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the town square. People cheered, they whistled, they shouted words of encouragement. The event director and her partner were clapping so hard, their palms stung. Tears of joy and sorrow and pure, unadulterated humanity streaming down their faces. The old man just stood there, a little dazed by the force of it all, a small, tired smile finally gracing his lips as he accepted the love that the crowd was giving back to him, a love that had been born from a single, loud, and beautiful song.